Ian Curtis, 23 years old, frontman of Joy Division, chooses death just hours before their first American tour, literally tearing apart the very song he wrote, "Love Will Tear Us Apart." May 18th, 1980. In a modest terraced house in Macclesfield, the silence is deafening. The tragedy isn't just personal, it's cultural, marking the abrupt end of one of Britain's most innovative bands and the loss of a singular artistic voice that had barely begun to explore its full potential. On the kitchen table lies a note, brief and devastating. Nearby, Iggy Pop's "The Idiot" still spins on the turntable, the needle caught in an endless loop, a fitting metaphor for a life that seemed trapped in cycles of creativity and despair. Breakthrough and breakdown. The house feels suspended in time, as if the very walls are holding their breath, unwilling to accept that the man who transformed isolation into art has chosen the ultimate isolation. But this ending is also a beginning, the birth of a legend that will influence countless musicians and capture the imaginations of generations who weren't even born when Joy Division played their final show. Within hours of the discovery, the myth-making begins. But beneath the mythology lies a starker truth. This is what happens when extraordinary sensitivity meets inadequate support, when artistic genius collides with undiagnosed mental illness in an era before proper understanding or care. The questions multiply like ripples in dark water. Was this the inevitable conclusion of an artist too sensitive for the world? A victim of medical limitations and social stigma? Or simply a young man overwhelmed by pressures that seemed impossible to bear? One thing remains certain: Ian Curtis had transformed post-punk music into something resembling prophecy, channeling the alienation and uncertainty of late 70s Britain into songs that felt like transmissions from a future that had already failed. To understand how this story ended so tragically yet so powerfully, we must first understand how it began. In the industrial landscape of Greater Manchester, where a shy, bookish teenager discovered that his internal darkness could become external art, and learned the dangerous lesson that sometimes the most beautiful music emerges from the deepest pain. July 15th, 1956. Ian Kevin Curtis enters the world in Stretford, Manchester during one of Britain's most optimistic decades. The post-war rebuilding is in full swing. The welfare state promises security for all, and young people are discovering new freedoms through rock and roll. Yet even in this era of possibility, the industrial North remains a landscape of contradictions, gleaming new developments rising alongside crumbling Victorian architecture, prosperity coexisting with persistent class divisions, hope shadowed by the memory of recent trauma. Ian's childhood unfolds in this environment of cautious optimism and lingering uncertainty. His parents, Kevin and Doreen Curtis, represent the aspirational working class, people who believe education and hard work can lift their children beyond the limitations that define their own lives. Kevin works as a clerk. Doreen manages the household with quiet efficiency, and together they create a home environment that values learning, respectability, and the kind of quiet achievement that doesn't draw unwanted attention. From an early age, Ian displays the characteristics that will later define both his artistic genius and his personal struggles. An almost painful sensitivity to his surroundings, a voracious appetite for books and ideas far beyond his years, and a tendency toward introspection that sometimes borders on complete withdrawal from the external world. While other children play football in the streets or gather around the television for children's programs, Ian retreats to his bedroom with volumes of poetry, philosophy, and literature that seem startlingly advanced for someone his age. He was always different, his mother later recalls with a mixture of pride and concern, not antisocial but internal, like he was processing the world differently than everyone else, seeing patterns and connections that weren't visible to the rest of us. The move to Macclesfield when Ian is 12 represents his parents' attempt to provide better opportunities, a more middle-class environment, better schools, escape from the industrial grimness of Stretford. But for Ian, the transition only intensifies his sense of being an outsider. At King's School, where he excels academically but struggles socially, his differences become more pronounced. He's drawn to the darker corners of literature and philosophy. Existentialists who question the nature of meaning. Modernist poets who explore fragmentation and alienation. Novelists who probe the psychological complexities of human behavior. It's during these formative years that Ian first encounters the writers who will profoundly shape his worldview. J.G. Ballard's explorations of technology and alienation. William Burroughs' fragmented narratives of control and liberation. The existentialist philosophers who suggest that human existence might be fundamentally absurd. These aren't typical teenage reading materials, but they speak to something in Ian's developing consciousness. A recognition that beneath the surface of ordinary life lies a vast complexity that most people either can't see or choose to ignore. Love and isolation, the twin forces that will define Ian's entire existence, make their first appearance during his teenage years. Love comes in the form of Deborah Woodruff, a bright, practical young woman who provides stability and companionship in his otherwise solitary world. Their relationship develops slowly, built on shared interests in books and music, long conversations about philosophy and poetry, and a mutual recognition that they're both slightly apart from their peers. Older, more serious, seeking something beyond the conventional pleasures of teenage life. But isolation remains the stronger force. The first signs of what will later be diagnosed as epilepsy appear during this period, though they're initially dismissed as fainting spells or nervous exhaustion. The seizures are infrequent at first, isolated incidents that seem unconnected to any larger pattern. But they introduce an element of unpredictability into Ian's life, a reminder that his body, like his mind, operates according to rules he doesn't fully understand or control. Could their early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? For Ian, the answer lies in his unusual capacity for empathy and observation. Gifts that will enable him to write lyrics of startling emotional precision, but will also make him vulnerable to every form of pain and contradiction he perceives in the world around him. The transformation begins on June 4th, 1976 at the Lesser Free Trade Hall in Manchester, where a skinny teenager with literary pretensions encounters the Sex Pistols and experiences something approaching a religious conversion. The show is chaotic, aggressive, transformative, everything that conventional entertainment is not. But more importantly, it demonstrates that music can be a vehicle for ideas, not just pleasure. That night, watching Johnny Rotten sneer at the audience's expectations, Ian understands that art doesn't have to comfort or console. It can challenge, provoke, even disturb. Picture this moment. The venue is half empty, the sound system barely adequate, the performance rough and unpolished. But in that shabby room, something essential about the future of British music is being born. Ian stands transfixed, absorbing not just the music but the attitude, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, the rejection of everything safe and commercial and focus grouped. "That's when I knew what I wanted to do," he later tells a journalist. Not just play music, but use music to say things that needed to be said, things that no one else was willing to articulate. After leaving school in 1975 with strong A-levels, Ian makes a decision that puzzles many who know his academic abilities. Instead of pursuing university, he takes a job as an assistant youth employment officer in Macclesfield. It's steady, respectable work that involves helping unemployed young people find jobs and navigate the benefits system. For someone with his intellectual gifts, it seems like a waste of potential. But Ian sees something different in the job, an opportunity to understand the reality of working-class life from the inside, to witness firsthand the effects of economic uncertainty and social displacement that are becoming increasingly common in late 1970s Britain. Every day he meets young people whose dreams have been derailed by unemployment, whose futures seem circumscribed by circumstances beyond their control. Their stories inform his developing understanding of how individual suffering connects to larger social and economic forces. "I am not living, I am surviving," he writes in his diary during this period, a phrase that captures both his own psychological state and the condition of the people he serves. The distinction becomes crucial for someone whose art depends on intense emotional engagement. Mere survival represents a kind of death in itself. The transition from observer to participant begins in 1977, when Ian places an advertisement in a local music paper. "Singer seeks musicians to form punk band." The response comes from Bernard Sumner, a quiet electronics enthusiast, and Peter Hook, a bass player whose distinctive melodic style seems to invent new possibilities for the instrument. The chemistry between the three is immediate and undeniable, and when they recruit drummer Stephen Morris, the lineup that will become Joy Division is complete. The name itself, originally Warsaw, later changed to avoid confusion with another band, reflects Ian's growing fascination with historical extremes and human behavior under pressure. Joy Division comes from a novella about Nazi concentration camps, a choice that some find provocative. But for Ian, it represents an attempt to confront the darkest aspects of human experience rather than ignore them, to use art as a means of processing trauma that extends far beyond personal experience. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? The question becomes relevant as Ian's musical ambitions crystallize into something more serious than teenage experimentation. The band's sound evolves rapidly, moving away from straightforward punk aggression towards something darker and more experimental. Ian's vocals develop from shouty punk sloganeering into something more controlled and expressive, a baritone delivery that can shift from whispered vulnerability to commanding intensity within a single song. The epilepsy, meanwhile, becomes more frequent and severe, a medical reality that intersects with his artistic vision in ways both productive and destructive. The seizures are unpredictable, striking without warning during performances, interviews, or ordinary social situations. Each episode leaves Ian exhausted and disoriented, but he refuses to let the condition limit his activities. If anything, he seems determined to push himself harder, as if aware that his time might be limited and urgent to accomplish everything possible while he can. The medication available in 1979 to 80 is crude compared to modern treatments. Phenytoin and carbamazepine that help control seizures but create debilitating side effects. Ian experiences cognitive dulling that makes reading and writing more difficult, emotional flatness that interferes with his ability to connect with others, and physical coordination problems that affect his stage performance. The drugs that keep him alive also threaten to destroy the very sensitivity that makes his art possible. Medical understanding of epilepsy's psychological effects is limited during this period. Doctors focus on preventing seizures without adequately addressing the depression, anxiety, and social stigma that often accompany the condition. Ian receives prescriptions but little counseling, medication but minimal emotional support. The isolation inherent in his neurological condition becomes compounded by a healthcare system that treats symptoms without acknowledging the human being who suffers them. "Nobody really understood what I was going through," Ian confides to a close friend during this period. "The doctors saw the seizures, my family saw the mood changes, the band saw the performance problems. But nobody saw how all of it connected, how the medicine that stopped the fits made everything else worse." The breakthrough comes with Tony Wilson's recognition of their potential. Wilson, the television presenter and entrepreneur who will become their manager, understands immediately that this isn't just another punk band. Ian's lyrics are too sophisticated, the music too complex and atmospheric, the overall vision too complete and original. But success brings its own form of isolation. The 1979 release of Unknown Pleasures, produced by Martin Hannett's innovative studio techniques, transforms Joy Division from promising local band to international influence almost overnight. Ian's lyrics on the album are revelatory. She's Lost Control draws directly from his work at the employment office, telling the story of a young woman whose epileptic seizures mirror his own condition, blurring the line between professional observation and personal confession. Behind all that artistic achievement, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The question becomes increasingly relevant as Joy Division's success creates new pressures and complications in Ian's personal life. The demands of touring, recording, and promotion begin to conflict with his day job and his responsibilities as a husband and father. Deborah gives birth to their daughter Natalie in 1979, adding another layer of obligation and concern to an already complicated existence. Picture this scene. Ian arriving home after a concert, still buzzing with the intensity of performance, to find Deborah feeding baby Natalie in the kitchen. The contrast is jarring, the private world of domestic responsibility colliding with the public world of artistic expression. In these moments, the different aspects of his life seem irreconcilable, demanding different versions of himself that can't coexist in the same space. The marriage, which had provided stability during Ian's transition from teenager to artist, begins to show signs of strain under these pressures. Deborah, who had fallen in love with a quiet, bookish young man, now finds herself married to someone who spends increasing amounts of time away from home, whose mood swings become more extreme, whose seizures require constant vigilance and care. "I felt like I was losing him," she later writes in her memoir. "Not to another woman, but to something I couldn't compete with. The music, the illness, the depression that seemed to get deeper as the band became more successful." Love, as Ian's most famous song predicts, does indeed begin to tear things apart. The situation becomes more complicated in 1979 when Ian meets Annick Honoré, a Belgian journalist who interviews Joy Division for a European music magazine. The attraction is immediate and powerful. Annick shares Ian's intellectual interests, understands his artistic vision, and seems to accept rather than fear the darker aspects of his personality. What begins as a professional relationship quickly develops into something more intimate and consuming. Ian finds himself caught between two worlds: his domestic life in Macclesfield, with its responsibilities and routines, and the artistic and romantic possibilities represented by Annick and the international music scene. The contradiction tears at him, creating guilt about his marriage while intensifying his sense that conventional life might be impossible for someone with his temperament and condition. The strain manifests most visibly in his performances, which become increasingly intense and unpredictable. Ian develops a distinctive stage presence, a combination of controlled movement and sudden convulsive gestures that seem to channel both his epilepsy and his emotional state. The movements are hypnotic and disturbing, leaving audiences unsure whether they're witnessing artistic expression or genuine medical crisis. Picture this scene. Ian on stage at a small venue in Manchester, the lights strobing as he performs "She's Lost Control." His body moves in sharp, angular motions that echo the rhythmic seizures described in the song. The audience is mesmerized, unsure whether his convulsive dancing is intentional choreography or an actual epileptic episode. The boundary between performance and reality dissolves, creating a moment of artistic truth that's both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Watching Ian perform, observes a music journalist, was like watching someone expose their nervous system to an audience. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time. You couldn't look away, but you also couldn't shake the feeling that you were witnessing something too private, too raw for public consumption. Did this tragic event mark their downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems that had been building throughout their career? By early 1980, it becomes clear that the various pressures in Ian's life are reaching a breaking point. The epilepsy is becoming more severe, requiring stronger medication that affects his mood and energy levels. The success of Unknown Pleasures creates demand for constant touring and promotion at exactly the moment when travel and performance are becoming most difficult for him. The relationship with Anik intensifies, leading to discussions about leaving England and starting a new life in Belgium. But the practical implications, abandoning his daughter, ending his marriage, giving up his job, seem almost impossible to contemplate. Ian begins to speak of feeling trapped, caught between obligations he can't abandon and desires he can't ignore. The band, meanwhile, is working on material for what will become Closer, their second and final album. The sessions take place at Britannia Row Studios in London, a clinical environment that seems to amplify the emotional intensity of the music being created. Producer Martin Hannett, known for his innovative use of digital delay and reverb, captures performances that feel both intimate and vast, as if Ian's voice is echoing from the bottom of an emotional abyss. The songs are darker and more introspective than anything on Unknown Pleasures, dealing explicitly with themes of mental illness, relationship breakdown, and spiritual crisis. Each track feels like a chapter in an autobiography that Ian may not live to finish. Atrocity Exhibition, with its fragmented imagery and disjointed rhythm, reads like a map of psychological disintegration. A Means to an End explores the terrible logic of despair with clinical precision. The Eternal sounds like a hymn for the damned, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Love Will Tear Us Apart, recorded during this period, captures the contradictions of Ian's situation with devastating clarity. A love song that's also a farewell, a statement of hope that sounds like an epitaph. The recording process itself becomes a form of therapy and torture simultaneously. Ian's voice cracks with emotion as he sings the words that seem to predict his own fate. Do you cry out in your sleep, all my failings exposed? The question hangs in the air long after the session ends, unanswered and unanswerable. But perhaps the most revealing song from this period is Isolation, which seems to channel Ian's psychological state with frightening accuracy. In fear every day, every evening, he calls her aloud from above, carefully watched for a reason, painstaking devotion and love. The lyrics capture both his desperate need for connection and his growing sense of being fundamentally alone, unable to bridge the gap between his inner experience and the external world. When he performs it live, the song becomes a kind of public confession, each word weighted with personal truth that makes audiences uncomfortable with their voyeuristic role. During these sessions, the other band members begin to notice changes in Ian that go beyond the obvious physical deterioration. His perfectionism becomes obsessive. He'll insist on retaking vocal parts dozens of times, never quite satisfied with the emotional truth he's captured. Between takes, he sits in the studio corner reading Dostoevsky or Kafka, writers whose explorations of psychological extremity seem to provide him with a vocabulary for experiences that ordinary language can't express. He was disappearing into the music, Stephen Morris later recalls, not just performing it, but becoming it, like the songs were more real to him than the world outside the studio. The creative process becomes increasingly isolating even within the band. Where Unknown Pleasures had been a collaborative effort, with each member contributing to the overall sound, Closer feels dominated by Ian's singular vision of despair. His lyrics become more cryptic and personal, filled with references that his bandmates don't always understand but instinctively recognize as important. The music serves his emotional needs rather than any commercial considerations, creating art that's both deeply personal and universally resonant. Factory Records, the label founded by Tony Wilson, becomes both support system and additional pressure. Wilson believes passionately in Joy Division's artistic importance, but his idealistic approach to the music business, refusing to tie artists to restrictive contracts, prioritizing artistic freedom over financial security, creates an environment where Ian's struggles receive inadequate professional attention. The label's libertarian philosophy assumes that artists can manage their own affairs, but Ian's condition requires the kind of structured support that the independent music scene of 1979 to 80 simply isn't equipped to provide. The Factory Records offices located in Manchester's industrial quarter become a second home for Ian during this period. He spends hours there discussing art, literature, and philosophy with Wilson and other factory artists, conversations that feed his intellectual appetite but also intensify his sense of being different from ordinary people. The label's aesthetic, stark, minimalist, uncompromising, reflects Ian's own artistic philosophy but also reinforces his tendency toward emotional extremity. The recording sessions for Closer reveal the extent of Ian's deterioration in ways that go beyond the obvious physical symptoms. He struggles to complete vocal takes not just because of fatigue, but because the emotional content of the song seems to drain something essential from him. Each performance becomes a form of psychological archaeology, excavating feelings and experiences that might be better left buried. Studio engineer Chris Nagel later describes the sessions as unlike anything else in his experience. Ian would arrive looking exhausted, spend hours in silence reading or writing in his notebook, then suddenly come alive when it was time to record. But it wasn't normal energy. It was like he was channeling something from outside himself. The performances were extraordinary, but watching them was painful. You felt like you were witnessing someone systematically dismantling their own psyche. The physical environment of the studio becomes almost sacramental during these sessions. Ian insists on specific lighting conditions, dim, almost subterranean, that create an atmosphere more suited to seances than rock recording. He requires complete silence between takes, using the time to enter a meditative state that seems to prepare him for the emotional violence of each song. His bandmates learn to communicate through gestures and written notes, understanding instinctively that any disruption might shatter the fragile psychological equilibrium that makes the recordings possible. Between the Closer sessions and his final performance, Ian's daily routine becomes increasingly ritualistic. He wakes before dawn to write in his journal, fills pages with philosophical reflections, song fragments, and observations about the people he encounters at his job. His handwriting becomes more erratic during this period, sometimes flowing smoothly, other times cramped and barely legible, as if his physical coordination is beginning to mirror his psychological instability. His reading during this final phase becomes obsessive and prophetic. In addition to Dostoevsky and Kafka, he discovers the poetry of Sylvia Plath, whose explorations of depression and isolation resonate with devastating accuracy. He copies passages into his notebook, particularly lines from Edge and Ariel that seem to speak directly to his condition. Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf, with its themes of alienation and the divided self, becomes another touchstone during this period. The American tour, scheduled for May 1980, represents both the culmination of everything Joy Division has worked toward and the ultimate test of Ian's ability to function as a professional musician. The logistics alone seem overwhelming. Visa applications, travel arrangements, promotional interviews. the physical demands of performing in unfamiliar venues for audiences who know the band only through recordings. For someone whose epilepsy makes even local travel challenging, the prospect of an international tour creates anxiety that compounds his existing psychological pressures. Rob Gretton, the band's manager, recognizes Ian's deteriorating condition, but lacks the expertise to address it effectively. The music industry in 1980 has no protocols for dealing with musicians who suffer from serious medical conditions. The assumption is that artistic temperament can overcome any obstacle, that creativity itself provides adequate compensation for personal suffering. Gretton tries to reduce external pressures on Ian but cannot address the internal factors that make each day a struggle for survival. Picture this scene from early May 1980. Ian sits in Gretton's office reviewing the American tour itinerary, a document that represents everything he's worked toward as a musician. The venues are prestigious, the advance press is enthusiastic, the financial prospects are better than anything Joy Division has previously experienced. But as he studies the schedule, 16 shows in 18 days, constant travel, hotel rooms, interviews, photo sessions, his hands begin to shake. The paper flutters in his grip like a captured bird. "I don't know if I can do this," he tells Gretton quietly. "Not the performing, I can always perform. But everything else, the being on all the time, the pretending everything's normal when nothing feels normal anymore." Gretton, a practical man who believes that most problems can be solved through better organization, suggests modifications to the tour schedule. Fewer interviews, longer breaks between shows, private transportation instead of commercial flights. But Ian shakes his head. The problem isn't logistical, it's existential. The tour represents a level of professional commitment that seems to require abandoning the last vestiges of his private self. The situation with Anik reaches its climax during this period. Their correspondence becomes more intense and frequent, filled with discussions of literature, philosophy, and the possibility of escape from the constraints of conventional life. Anik represents not just romantic possibility but intellectual companionship. Someone who understands his artistic vision without being intimidated by its darkness. When she suggests that he leave England and join her in Belgium, the offer seems like both salvation and betrayal. Picture this scene. Ian walking through Macclesfield's town centre on a grey afternoon in early May, his mind occupied with Anik's latest letter. The familiar streets feel like a prison, but they're also the only home his daughter will ever know. He stops outside a children's clothing store, watching through the window as mothers shop for their babies, and realizes that leaving would mean abandoning not just Deborah but Natalie, condemning himself to the role of absent father that he'd always sworn to avoid. The internal dialogue that consumes him during this period becomes audible in his final performances. When Joy Division plays "Love Will Tear Us Apart" at their last concert, Ian's vocal delivery carries a weight of personal knowledge that transforms the song from prophecy into confession. The audience hears it as artistic expression, but those who know him recognize it as autobiography set to music. His bandmates, meanwhile, remain largely unaware of the severity of his psychological crisis. The artistic process has always been Ian's private domain. He writes lyrics alone, refuses to explain their meaning, presents finished songs without inviting collaboration or comment. This creative independence, which had made Joy Division's music so distinctively personal, now isolates him from the very people who might have been able to help. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Ian, the question becomes literal as well as metaphorical. The seizures are now affecting his daily life in ways that make normal functioning increasingly difficult. The medication helps control the epilepsy but creates side effects, depression, fatigue, cognitive dulling, that interfere with both his artistic work and his personal relationships. The American tour, scheduled for May 1980, represents both an opportunity and a crisis. Joy Division has never performed in the United States, and the trip promises to expand their audience and establish them as an international, rather than merely British phenomenon. But for Ian, the prospect of extended travel and performance seems almost unbearable given his physical and emotional condition. Picture this scene. Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook packing equipment for the American tour on the morning of May 18th, excited about the breakthrough opportunity that awaits them across the Atlantic. They joke about American audiences, discuss which songs to include in their set list, plan for interviews with music journalists who have been following their career from afar. The future seems bright with possibility. Meanwhile, in Macclesfield, Ian sits alone in his kitchen, having just written his final journal entry. "I am not living, I am surviving." The distinction that has haunted him throughout his brief career crystallizes into its starkest form. For someone whose art depended on intense emotional engagement, mere survival represents the ultimate artistic failure. The pressure to maintain his responsibilities as a performer, husband, and father while managing a serious medical condition and navigating complex emotional relationships proves overwhelming. Ian begins to speak more frequently about feeling trapped, about seeing no way forward that doesn't involve abandoning either his art or his family obligations. On May 17, 1980, Ian spends the evening at home with Deborah, watching Werner Herzog's Stroszek, a film about a man who emigrates to America in search of a better life, but finds only alienation and despair. The choice of film seems grimly appropriate. Like Ian, Herzog's protagonist is someone whose sensitivity makes him ill-suited for the demands of ordinary life. After Deborah goes to bed, Ian remains downstairs listening to Iggy Pop's The Idiot and writing in his journal. The album plays on repeat, its themes of isolation and existential despair providing the soundtrack for his final hours. The repetition becomes hypnotic, a mechanical rhythm that matches his psychological state, trapped in patterns he can't escape, cycling through the same thoughts and feelings without resolution. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? The question will be debated for decades, but what seems clear is that Ian had reached a point where the contradictions in his life had become unbearable. The artistic vision that made him a compelling performer also made him vulnerable to psychological pressures that might not have affected someone less sensitive or introspective. The discovery, on the morning of May 18th, sends shockwaves through the music world and beyond. Joy Division was on the verge of international breakthrough. Love Will Tear Us Apart was climbing the charts, and Ian Curtis seemed poised to become one of the defining voices of his generation. Instead, at 23, he becomes a cautionary tale about the importance of mental health support and the dangers of leaving sensitive individuals to struggle alone with overwhelming pressures. The immediate response reveals both the power of his artistic legacy and the tragic waste of his death. Tony Wilson, devastated by the loss of both a friend and an artist he believed could change music forever, struggles to understand how someone with so much to offer could see no way forward. The remaining members of Joy Division, Bernard, Peter, and Stephen, face the impossible task of continuing without the voice and vision that had defined their identity as a band. Within months, they reform as New Order, creating music that honors Ian's memory while moving in radically new directions. Their success will eventually eclipse that of Joy Division, proving that artistic evolution can emerge from personal tragedy. But they never forget the friend and collaborator whose death created the space for their transformation. Everything we did afterward, Peter Hook later reflects, was somehow connected to Ian, to what he would have thought or wanted or done. He was always there in the music, even when we were moving as far away from Joy Division as possible. The posthumous release of Closer and Love Will Tear Us Apart transforms Ian Curtis from cult figure to lasting influence. The album, completed before his death but released afterward, feels like a message from beyond, songs that seem to predict their own impact, lyrics that read like prophecy. The title track becomes an anthem for anyone who has experienced the pain of relationships destroyed by forces beyond their control. More importantly, Ian's story begins to illuminate the broader issues of mental health awareness and support systems that were inadequate in 1980 but have since improved dramatically. His death becomes a catalyst for conversations about depression, epilepsy, and the particular pressures faced by creative individuals who struggle with these conditions. The mythology that develops around Ian Curtis contains both truth and dangerous romanticization. On one hand, his story provides valuable insights into the relationship between artistic sensitivity and psychological vulnerability. On the other hand, it risks suggesting that self-destruction is somehow connected to authentic artistic expression, a fallacy that has influenced countless young artists who mistake suffering for authenticity. If Ian had been born 20 years later, suggests a music historian, with better medical care, more awareness of mental health issues, and stronger support systems, the story might have ended very differently. His art didn't require his death. That's a romantic fallacy that does disservice to both his memory and to other artists struggling with similar challenges. The influence of Joy Division extends far beyond music into fashion, visual art, and cultural theory. The stark, minimalist aesthetic of their album covers, performance style, and overall presentation provides a template for alternative culture that remains influential decades later. Ian's combination of intellectual sophistication and emotional directness creates a model for artistic authenticity that countless performers attempt to emulate. Yet perhaps the most important aspect of Ian Curtis's legacy is the way his story illustrates both the power and the limitations of art as a means of processing psychological pain. His lyrics provide profound insights into depression, alienation, and spiritual crisis, offering comfort and recognition to listeners who have experienced similar struggles. But they also demonstrate that artistic expression, however brilliant, cannot substitute for proper medical care, emotional support, and community connection. The cemetery in Macclesfield where Ian Curtis is buried has become an unlikely pilgrimage site, with fans leaving flowers, stones, and handwritten notes expressing what his music has meant to them. The simple gravestone, inscribed with "Love Will Tear Us Apart," serves as a reminder that behind every artistic legacy is a human story of struggle, achievement, and loss. What hidden secrets might still remain untold behind their public image? In Ian's case, the primary secret seems to have been the extent of his suffering. The gap between his public persona as a confident visionary artist and his private experience of illness, confusion, and despair. Those who knew him best recognized that his death wasn't a philosophical statement or artistic gesture, but the tragic end of a young man who couldn't find a way to continue living with the pressures and contradictions that defined his existence. Music turned pain into prophecy. But to preserve the prophecy, the prophet erased himself. For Ian Curtis, the voice of post-punk and the fragile oracle of a generation's uncertainty, that distinction between the art and the artist would prove to be everything. His final performance, captured on film just weeks before his death, shows him singing "Love Will Tear Us Apart" with an intensity that encompasses everything he couldn't say in ordinary conversation. A moment of pure artistic transcendence that reminds us that transcendence, however beautiful, is not the same as healing.